guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is a guide to make this chunky knit cardigan that I'm wearing right here. But before we get started, I'm just going to give you a little backstory on how this cardigan came to be. I still get requested for cardigan patterns more than anything else that I make. So I wanted to make sure that I could eventually put one out for you guys. It's not only with writing patterns, but even with making things. I personally take forever to make something if it's too complicated or if it's taking too much time. When I'm not seeing progress, I end up just putting it down for a little while and making something that's a little bit quicker and easier just so that I can have that instant gratification of making something. I have a feeling that a lot of you guys and other people out there are very similar because my Ski Lodge pullover pattern, which is another chunky knit, it's just a pullover, but it's kind of similar to this, is by far my most popular pattern. I think maybe because it's easy, but also because you can work it up so quickly and then have something that you can wear within a few days. So yeah, basically I just wanted to make a very simple, as basic as possible, as easy as possible, knit chunky cardigan for myself and as well for you guys. So the reason that this ended up being a scrappy cardigan was because I started it while I was in quarantine for COVID, so I couldn't leave my apartment to go and buy any yarn for it. And I also had a lot of free time on my hands, so I wanted to get it started right away, and I didn't want to wait for yarn to be delivered to me. So I just decided to use what I had in my apartment. This came to be because I had 3 or 4 friends this year, non-knitting friends, who had sent me pictures of pictures that they had seen on Pinterest or Instagram of chunky sweaters that were kind of their inspiration of why they wished that they could knit, or something that they would make if they could knit, or even asking me to make them for them. And actually 3 out of 4 of them had kind of this like inside out look to them where the stitching changes. So I figured, because this was already going to be kind of a scrappy, colorful cardigan, why not try and use that trend on this one? So one thing I'd like to mention before we get into the video is that I made this sweater and this pattern and this video so that basically all levels of knitters could make this, right down to pretty basic beginner. If you know how to do a knit stitch and you know how to do a purl stitch, you can cast on, you can cast off, and you can do a seam, then you can make this sweater. So as well, this is a scrappy cardigan. So for those 2 reasons, not everything needs to be perfect looking, and honestly, not everything was done perfectly. So if you're a more advanced knitter and you're looking through this and you're like, oh, that's done wrong, or that's not how I would do it, then just do it differently. I kind of just did it the easiest way for me to do it and the easiest way for me to explain to a even non-knitter how to do it. So yeah, so don't stress too much while you're working through the pattern. With the gauge swatch, make it as close as possible. It doesn't need to be perfect. As you can see, it's pretty chunky and oversized. If your stitching isn't perfect, that's fine. If anything that you do isn't perfect, it's fine. Just try and get through it as close as possible and enjoy the process. Okay, so to make this sweater, you're going to need to grab the pattern, and that is available on my website or in my Etsy shop. Both of them are linked in the description below. You're also going to need yarn, obviously. You're going to want to use a chunky yarn. Most of mine, I had a few different odds and scraps, but most of mine was Lion Brand Wool Ease Thick and Quick. I honestly don't know how much yarn I used because it was a scrappy project, but basically I took something that I had the most of and used that as my accent color for these pieces. And then all of the rest, I kind of just made a random ball of yarn by tying together my scraps. You're gonna need 10mm circular knitting needles, and I have 2 here. Ideally, you'll have a long one and a short one. So as you can see here, my short set is 18 inches from tip to tip, and my long set is 30 inches from tip to tip. If you don't have 2 sets, you can use the long set for your sleeves as well. You'll just have to use the magic loop method. So you'll need a crochet hook. It honestly doesn't matter what size. This is basically just for hooking the yarn and pulling it through holes at certain times. So as long as it can hook the thick yarn, then that's fine. You'll need a measuring tape. You'll need a yarn needle for sewing in all of your ends, and you'll need scissors. And I think that's it. Probably stitch counters to make your life easier when counting stitches, but that's it. Okay, so now that I've got through all that, without further ado, let's get into it. Because this is an oversized sweater, instead of measuring your body for sizing, try measuring a sweater that you like. Like I said in the intro, just try and get close to the gauge. When you're using different types of yarn, especially when mixing them, the gauge can vary a little bit. Cast on with your accent color. Keep this color separate from your scrap yarn ball so that you always know that you have enough. Mine is added to the ball here, but that's just because I did it and then I redid it again to refilm this. So also here I'm using straight needles, which you can use because this part of the sweater is going to be a flat piece. But if all you have is your circular needles that I suggested, then those will work fine as well for the flat pieces. So once you've cast on the appropriate number of stitches, we're going to work up the ribbing in a purl 1, knit 1 pattern. So here you can see we're going to do a purl 1, and then knit 1, and then purl 1, and then knit 1. And you're just going to work up the ribbing, continuing that pattern. When you're working in knit 1, purl 1 ribbing, you always want to remember that a knit is a purl on the opposite side and a purl is a knit on the opposite side. So if you end your row with a knit stitch, you want to start the next row with a purl stitch and vice versa. Once you're done your ribbing, it should look like this. So once you've worked up your ribbing, we're going to do our first color change to start working the body. So you're going to take your ball of yarn, and we're on the wrong side of our work right now. So you're going to want to do a knit stitch all the way across this row. This means that when we turn our work so that it's on the right side facing out, that this row is going to look like a purl row. So as you can see here, the row is done. We've turned our work and the purl row is on the outside. So it kind of makes that color change look like it's inside out, if that makes sense. So now you're just going to continue to work in knit stitch on even rows or rows that are on the right side, and purl stitch on odd rows or rows that are on the wrong side of your work, unless you're doing a color change. So as you can see here, every time we've changed the color, even though we're working stockinette, all the color changes are kind of inverted. So they're a purl stitch on a knit row basically. So we're on a knit row right now. We're going to knit up to where the color changes. And once we reach that knot where the color changes, you're going to hold the knot in behind your work so it's on the wrong side and just purl the rest of the row. So basically you always want to do the opposite of what you're supposed to be doing in that row if you're working a color onto a different color. So here we have like the dark teal working onto the light blue in a knit row. So we're going to do the opposite and purl. So now when we're working on a purl row and we want to do a color change, we're going to do exactly the same as we did before, the opposite, and we're just going to knit when we do the color change. So here, dark teal on dark teal, we're just going to do purl as we would be doing in this row. And then when I get to the light blue part, this time I'm going to want to keep the knot towards me so that it's on the wrong side of the work. And then I'm just going to switch over and do a knit stitch when I get into the light blue color here. If you're a brand new knitter and you get to the stitch and you don't know what it means, don't worry. It's exactly what it sounds like. So you're going to insert your right needle through 2 stitches instead of 1, and then just knit as you would regularly. Knit two together is a right leaning decrease and SSK is a left leaning decrease. So it's just the opposite kind of thing. So you're gonna slip knitwise, slip purlwise with your right needle. Then with your left needle, you're gonna insert purlwise, yarn over your right needle, and then pull it under and over. This is where we're going to be splitting our piece into two shoulder pieces and kind of leaving a little space for the neck so that across the back of your neck is just, it's not all just one flat piece. So you're just going to work your way across normally, knitting like you would in this row. And when you get to the spot where you want your neck hole to be, you're just going to cast off the appropriate number for the neck hole, as you can see here. So when you're casting off, you want to make sure that you start with 2 stitches to cast off. If you just do 1 stitch and cast off, then you're casting off part that you still need for your shoulder. So knit 2, cast off, and then from there on you can just knit 1, cast off the last stitch, etc. And then once you've done all your cast off stitches, you're just going to continue to knit to the end of the row. So once you turn your work here, you can see that you clearly have 2 shoulder pieces with a gap in the middle. So you obviously can't work all the way across. So you're just going to work the first half here and just leave the second half on your needles. Don't really worry about it yet. So just finish working this half. And then once you've cast off this half, you can go back and work the other half. When your front and back pieces are done, they should be shaped kind of like this. Back piece in the middle, obviously, and the front 2 in the front. So you're going to want to arrange it like this and see this little V here. That's going to be where the armhole is. So you're starting your side seam just under there to the bottom line. So first we're going to do the crochet seam. It's pretty easy. So you just take your crochet hook, line the seam up. We're working right side out on both sides. So the inside of your work should be to the inside of your work and both of the outside on the outside. You're taking your accent color, just going to put it on the hook here. And then you're just going to go through, insert it through the front panel on the edge here and the back panel on the edge. Tricky, tricky. Then you're just going to yarn over, pull through, pull through. Show you that one more time. So go through both pieces, kind of catch your working yarn here, yarn over and pull through both. So that's just going to create a crochet seam along the outside all the way to the bottom. So this is what it'll look like when it's done. So here I'm going to show you the invisible seam if you want to just seam it up with your needle. So you have your working yarn and you want to insert your needle from the inside of your work coming out the outside. And then you're going to work across the seam and insert it from the outside to the inside. And then pull it out through the stitch directly beside it. Across the seam again, and then in from the outside, and then back out to the outside in the stitch directly beside it. Basically, when you're working across the seam to close it up, you always want your yarn to be coming from like the outside and then inserting it again through the outside so that when you pull it tight, the seam gets kind of caught in the middle of it. So as I work down, this is what this looks like. As you can see, it's invisible. So once you've got your front piece, seam to the back piece, you're gonna seam together your shoulder piece. This is another type of invisible seam. This works when you're working with knit stitches. The other one works when you're seaming basically anything. So you're gonna wanna find the little U shape or V shape hoop here. And you wanna basically guide your needle through it by following the exact same pattern. So you wanna look across here and see how that U is following. So you wanna kind of insert in the same direction, same as here. It's harder to explain than it is to just watch it. If you can't figure this out and it's too hard, you can honestly just seam it together however you want. This is just how I did it. So when we're picking it for the sleeves, I want this seam again to look like it's kind of inside out, or like I attached it in a purl stitch. So you're going to have to turn your work inside out. And then we're going to use our crochet hook and the accent color yarn. Again, I wouldn't already have it cut and attached. I just was redoing this. So you're gonna insert your hook from the inside of your work to the outside in basically the last stitch of the row. Not the edge hole, but the second hole from the edge. Then you're just gonna pull your working yarn through that little hole so that you have a loop that you can insert your needle into. So you're gonna work all the way along, just kind of pulling little loops through and then inserting your needle. So you wanna hold your working yarn kind of like on the right side of your work and pulling it through to the inside. This way, once you've pulled all the way around, you kind of have those visible stitches where you pulled it through. Once you've worked all the way around, then you can attach your new working color and you'll just work the entire sleeve in knit stitch unless you're doing a color change. So because you're working your entire sleeve in knit stitch, the color changes are pretty simple. They're all going to just be purl stitch. So just like before, as long as you're working a different color onto the color that's on your needles, you're going to want to do a purl stitch if it's on the sleeve. So here I will just purl around with the teal until I reach a spot where it is teal on my needles. Then I'll switch back to knit. So the entire sleeve is worked in the round with no decreases until you get to the sleeve where we want to tighten it up so that the wrist cuff is a little bit tighter on your wrist. So you're going to start with a knit 2 together. And in this first row, you're just going to have evenly spaced decreases. And they're all right leaning decreases because they're knit 2 together. So once I'm back where I started, as you can see here by my stitch marker placement, on top so that it lines up with where my other decrease was, I'm going to do a left leaning decrease. So there you can see where I did my first decrease. We're just going to do a slip, slip, knit. If you lose track of counter, you don't want to count when you're doing these rows of decreases. Just remember that they should be kind of stacked up on top of each other as you're working around. Now that we've decreased for the wrist cuff, you can cut your yarn and we're going to go back to your accent color again. And then just attach it and you're going to work one full row of purl stitch, as you can see here. And this also kind of shows the stacking of the decreases. It's easier to see on that blue than this black. So yeah, you're gonna work in the purl stitch all the way around, and as you know, that's what shows the little inside out seam. And then also, as you can see here, my wire is pulled out a little bit from my work. I had a lot of questions on my last video on what to do if your needles are too long to fit in the round. Basically, you just do that. Once you've worked that entire row purl stitch, you're going to start the cuff ribbing, where you're just going to work in a knit one, purl one ribbing again, all the way up the cuff. And then once the cuff is your desired thickness or length or whatever you want to call it, you're just going to do a knit one, purl one cast off here, working all the way around and casting off the entire cuff. Okay, we're almost done. Now we all have to do is add the last ribbing around the edging here and the collar, basically. So we're going to use our accent color yarn, our crochet hook, and our long set of needles. So turn your work inside out exactly as you did for the sleeves, and then we're going to pick up the stitches for this edging exactly the same as we picked it up for the sleeves. So because this sweater is a little bit cinched at the front, we want the ribbing to be like slightly tighter, not super loose. So I picked up a little over every other stitch, if that makes sense. Basically, I picked up 6 stitches for every 11 stitches. So again, just a little bit more than every other stitch. If you don't want your sweater to cinch up at the front, then you need to make this ribbing a little bit looser. So I would pick up a lot closer to every stitch. And when you're working along the back neckline, you'll want to pick up every stitch along there. That just gives it a little bit more room as it's turning around the neckline. Once you've got all your stitches on your needles and wire, as I have here, you're ready to start working up the ribbing, and it's going to be again in a purl one, knit one pattern. So right here, you can see I kind of messed up when I was pulling them on, because if I was to knit that properly, the stitch would be twisted. So here I'm going to kind of explain how I messed that up so you can avoid that. So when you're pulling your yarn through, keep your hook facing down and then twist it towards you. And then you're going to insert your needle there. So as you can see here, when I push my needle up, see how that's open? So when I did this, I did it the opposite way. So when I push that up, it's closed. And that's how you twist your stitches. So see how I'm pulling up here and then pulling towards me? This is kind of the real test. When you put your needle up towards you, see how that's not open and that's twisted? So it's not the end of the world. You can work twisted stitches. It's just going to be tighter and stiffer. So if you're like me and you did this wrong, don't worry about it. You can work your stitches just as I'm doing here. You'll notice that I'm not knitting normal here. So you're just going to work in the back so that the stitch stays open as you work it off your needle. So when you made your collar ribbing here basically as wide as you want to make it, you can cast off. I suggest casting off on an even number row so that you're casting off on the right side of your work, like I am here. So I cast off on my 6th row. You can make it 8 rows wide, 10 rows. But just casting off on the outside will keep it cleaner. Oh, and again here, as you can see, I cast off in a knit one, purl one pattern the whole way around. It just gives your cast off a little bit more stretch. Then you're gonna snip the end, and now you're ready to just sew in all your ends and add your buttons. Yes, I said buttons, and I haven't mentioned it yet in this video because it was an afterthought for me that my boyfriend told me to do. So I found 3 random buttons and I sewed them an equal length apart, and that's that. Okay, that's it. Thanks for joining me for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys were able to make your sweaters. When you get finished, please tag me in your pictures on Instagram. It's at ErinElizabethW, as shown here, and also linked in the description. Make sure that you subscribe to my channel so that you can see all of my future videos. And until next time, see you later.